I want you to pause for a moment wherever you are watching this, in the United States, in Jamaica, across the Caribbean, in Europe, because this is not just news from Africa. The United States has sent troops into Nigeria. Officials call it a small team. They call it assistance. They call it training. But history teaches us that moments like this are never only about numbers or names. They are about direction. Nigeria is Africa's giant. What happens there never stays there. When foreign military presence becomes normalized in a country of that weight, the signal travels far beyond its borders, to the Sahel, to West Africa, and to the Black world globally. I am not here to create fear. I am here to create awareness, because the most important shifts in geopolitics rarely arrive loudly. They arrive quietly, and then reshape everything. Let me speak carefully and clearly. Nigeria is facing real security pressure. Communities are under strain, lives have been disrupted, and the state is searching for ways to restore stability. These are serious challenges, and they deserve serious responses. But when external troops are introduced, even in small numbers, the conversation must widen. Security assistance is never only technical, it reshapes priorities, it influences how decisions are made, and over time, it affects how a nation understands its own capacity to protect itself. Training missions become doctrines, intelligence sharing becomes dependence. What begins as support can quietly become structure. For viewers in the United States, Jamaica, the Caribbean, Europe, and other high RPM countries, this may appear limited and practical. But for Africa, especially the Sahel, it raises a familiar question. What happens after assistance becomes routine? Nigeria is not a peripheral state. It is Africa's largest country, a regional anchor, and a reference point. When its security framework shifts, neighboring regions feel the effect. Politically, strategically, and psychologically. I am not questioning Nigeria's sovereignty or intentions. I am questioning the long-term architecture being normalized around it, because history shows us something consistent. When security is externalized too deeply, sovereignty does not vanish overnight. It becomes negotiable, step by step, and negotiated sovereignty rarely returns unchanged. Let us look at the details being shared, because clarity matters. What is described publicly is a small U.S. team operating with Nigeria's agreement, focused on training, intelligence support, and specialized capabilities. Officials say this is cooperation, not command, assistance, not control. These distinctions are important, and they deserve to be examined honestly. Africa has learned that security partnerships shape outcomes long after the first deployment. Training influences doctrine. Intelligence support influences targeting and priorities. Over time, these choices begin to define what a country believes it can do alone, and what it believes must always be done with others. For Black Americans, Jamaicans, Caribbean audiences, and Europeans watching, this may sound technical, but in the Sahel, it sounds familiar. We have seen arrangements that begin narrowly, expand quietly, and settle into permanence without public debate. Nigeria's weight makes this moment different. As a regional anchor, its decisions set expectations. When external security presence becomes normalized there, it changes how the region imagines its own options, politically and strategically. I am not dismissing Nigeria's challenges. I am asking a responsible question. How do we ensure support strengthens capacity without narrowing sovereignty? Because when assistance becomes the default answer, independence becomes a longer road, and long roads, if not watched carefully, often lead somewhere unintended. Now let us widen the lens, because Nigeria does not stand alone. What happens there sends a message across West Africa and the Sahel. It tells neighboring states what is considered acceptable, what is considered necessary, and what is considered inevitable. In geopolitics, precedents matter more than promises. For those watching from Black America, Jamaica, the Caribbean, and Europe, this is where history becomes relevant. Security arrangements often begin as responses to crisis, but over time they shape politics, budgets, and priorities. They influence which solutions are funded and which are delayed. They can strengthen institutions or quietly sideline them. The Sahel has lived through cycles where external security frameworks expanded faster than local capacity. The result was not always stability. Sometimes it produced coordination without confidence, presence without peace. Nigeria's scale changes the stakes. When a country of this size adjusts its security posture, smaller states watch closely. They ask whether they must follow the same path to be taken seriously, to be supported, to be protected. This is not about rejecting cooperation. It is about balance. Africa must ensure that assistance builds independence, not habits of reliance, that it strengthens regional coordination, not quiet competition, and that it leaves space for African solutions to mature. Because when choices are made without reflection, they become templates, and templates, once set, are hard to revise. I also want to speak directly to the diaspora because your perspective matters more than many realize. For Black Americans, Jamaicans, Caribbean people, and Africans living in Europe, Africa's security choices are often presented as distant or technical. But the truth is, these decisions shape how Africa is viewed, treated, and negotiated with globally, including in places where you live. When external military presence becomes the primary answer to African insecurity, it affects narratives everywhere. It influences how African states are discussed in policy rooms, how investment is structured, and how African voices are weighted in global debates. Security choices do not stay on the battlefield. They travel into economics, diplomacy, and perception. Many of you know this pattern from history. You have seen how temporary measures become long-term realities, how emergency responses redefine normalcy, and how communities are told later that there were no other options. This is why awareness is essential. I am not asking the diaspora to take sides. I am asking you to stay informed and engaged, because when Africa's choices are misunderstood or ignored, others interpret them on Africa's behalf. Nigeria's moment is not only Nigeria's moment, it is a reference point, watched closely by partners, neighbors, and institutions. And when reference points are set, they shape expectations for years to come. To understand this moment fully, we must also consider how such decisions are viewed from Washington. From the United States perspective, deployments like this are often framed as prevention, acting early to contain instability before it spreads. They are justified as limited, targeted, and cooperative. In policy language, they are described as risk management, but history shows us that risk management can become risk transfer. When security responsibility is shared unevenly, the long-term burden often falls on the host nation. Local forces adapt to external frameworks. Budgets adjust to sustain cooperation. Political leaders begin to calculate decisions with outside expectations in mind. This is not unique to Nigeria, and it is not new. For audiences in the United States and Europe, it is important to understand that Africa does not experience these moves as isolated policies. They are experienced as patterns that have shaped outcomes in multiple regions over decades. The question is not whether cooperation can help. The question is who defines success and on what timeline. Africa's security challenges require solutions that endure beyond rotations and briefings. They require regional trust, shared intelligence among neighbors, and institutions built for African realities. When external assistance aligns with those goals, it can be constructive. When it replaces them, it becomes a constraint. And constraints, once normalized, are difficult to remove. Let us now speak about regional consequences, because security does not respect borders. Nigeria's engagement with external partners inevitably affects how neighboring states plan, cooperate, and prioritize. When one country becomes a central node for foreign security involvement, others must decide whether to align, adapt, or distance themselves. This changes regional dynamics quietly but decisively. For the Sahel, this moment arrives at a sensitive time. Several countries are reassessing old security models and asking whether past arrangements delivered the stability they promised. These questions are not theoretical. They are grounded in lived experience. What concerns me is not cooperation itself, but imbalance. If security solutions are designed primarily outside the region, regional coordination weakens. If intelligence flows outward faster than it circulates among neighbors, trust erodes. And if responses are shaped by external timelines, local realities are often sidelined. For Black Americans and Caribbean audiences, this mirrors patterns you have seen elsewhere. Decisions taken far away, justified as urgent, and later defended as unavoidable. Africa must avoid repeating cycles where presence increases, but confidence does not. Regional security works best when neighbors build capacity together, share responsibility equitably, and retain ownership of outcomes. External partners can support that process, but they cannot substitute for it. When substitution occurs, cooperation quietly turns into dependence, and dependence, once embedded, reshapes the future more than any single deployment ever could. I want to return again to why this matters beyond Africa, especially for Black people in the United States, Jamaica, and across the Caribbean. Security decisions shape economics. They influence where capital flows, how infrastructure is financed, and which priorities are funded first. When a country's stability becomes closely tied to external security arrangements, investors and institutions begin to calculate risk differently. This affects development paths for years, sometimes decades. Many in the diaspora understand this instinctively. You have seen how security narratives can override social needs, how resources meant for schools, hospitals, and communities are redirected toward maintaining frameworks that were supposed to be temporary. Nigeria's role as an economic anchor in West Africa makes this especially important. Its choices influence regional markets, labor movement, and confidence. When uncertainty grows around security architecture, it spills into everyday life. Prices, opportunities, and futures. This is why I speak not only as a head of state, but as someone aware of shared histories. Africa and the diaspora are connected by more than heritage. We are connected by consequences. I am not suggesting fear or rejection. I am suggesting attention, because when security becomes the dominant lens through which a nation is viewed, everything else is measured against it. And nations deserve to be defined by more than the challenges they are trying to overcome. So what then is the alternative? Africa does not need to choose between isolation and dependence. There is a third path, one built on regional coordination, shared responsibility, and confidence in African-led solutions. This path is not fast, and it is not easy, but it is durable. Security challenges that cross borders require cooperation that also crosses borders, among Africans first. Intelligence sharing within the region, joint training among neighboring forces, and institutions designed for local realities create resilience that no external deployment can replace. External partners can support this work when their role is clear, limited, and accountable, but the center of gravity must remain African. When ownership is local, outcomes are more likely to endure beyond political cycles elsewhere. For Black Americans, Jamaicans, Caribbean people, and Europeans watching, this is a reminder that sovereignty today is not only about flags and borders, it is about who designs the systems that shape a nation's future. Africa's credibility will grow not by rejecting engagement, but by defining its terms, by deciding what kind of support strengthens independence and what quietly weakens it. This moment in Nigeria is an opportunity not just to respond to pressure, but to rethink architecture. Because when Africans lead the design, cooperation becomes partnership, and partnership, when grounded in ownership, protects dignity as well as security. There is another element we must address carefully: how this story is told. Media narratives shape understanding long before policy outcomes are felt. When deployments are framed only as technical fixes, the deeper implications are rarely discussed. Attention focuses on immediacy, not trajectory, on action, not consequence. For audiences in the United States, Jamaica, the Caribbean, and Europe, this is familiar. You have seen how complex realities are compressed into simple explanations, how questions about duration, oversight, and long-term impact are postponed until after structures are already in place. Africa must learn to read beyond the headline. When a military presence is described as small or temporary, the words matter, but so does the silence around timelines, benchmarks, and exit conditions. What is not said often shapes outcomes more than what is announced. This is why I urge awareness, not alarm. Nigeria's situation deserves understanding, not judgment. But understanding requires asking complete questions. Who defines success? Who measures progress? And who decides when assistance has achieved its purpose? These questions are not confrontational. They are responsible, because when narratives move faster than accountability, structures solidify quietly, and quiet permanence is the most powerful form of change. As I bring this message toward its close, I want to be very clear about my intention. This is not a warning born of suspicion, and it is not a judgment passed from afar. It is a reminder drawn from experience, Africa's experience, that security decisions echo long after the moment that created them has passed. Nigeria's challenges are real, its choices are sovereign, but sovereignty is not only about the right to decide, it is also about the responsibility to foresee, to ask how today's solutions shape tomorrow's options. For my brothers and sisters in Black America, Jamaica, the Caribbean, and Europe, this is where connection matters. When Africa's future is negotiated through security frameworks, it affects how the Black world is positioned globally, politically, economically, and culturally. I do not ask for fear, I ask for attention. I do not ask for opposition, I ask for understanding, because power moves quietly now. It moves through agreements, assumptions, and structures that appear reasonable in isolation, but transformative in accumulation. Africa must remain awake in moments like this. awake enough to cooperate wisely, awake enough to preserve ownership, awake enough to remember that stability achieved without sovereignty is fragile. This moment in Nigeria is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of a question. I will end with this thought because it matters for the future we are all shaping. Africa is entering a period where decisions will be made faster than explanations, and structures will form before debates catch up. In such moments, awareness becomes the most valuable resource we have. Not outrage, not fear, awareness. For Nigeria, the challenge is not choosing partners. It is ensuring that every partnership strengthens national capacity rather than replacing it. For the Sahel, the task is learning from experience, not repeating it. And for the Black diaspora, in the United States, Jamaica, the Caribbean, and Europe, the responsibility is to stay informed, engaged, and thoughtful about how Africa's story is told and understood. Geopolitics today is less about dramatic confrontations and more about quiet alignment. It is shaped by what becomes normal, by what goes unquestioned, and by what is allowed to settle without reflection. I speak not to instruct, but to invite clarity. Africa's strength has never been isolation. It has been resilience, adaptation, and the ability to learn across generations. If we carry those qualities forward with attention and unity, cooperation can serve progress without costing sovereignty. That is the balance we must protect, and that is why moments like this deserve our full attention, not just for today, but for the future we are building together. Let me conclude with clarity, calm, and responsibility. Africa is not rejecting cooperation, and Africa is not afraid of partnership. What Africa must protect, however, is ownership. Ownership of decisions, ownership of priorities, and ownership of the future those decisions create. The presence of foreign troops in Nigeria is being discussed today as a limited response to immediate security challenges. That framing may be accurate in the short term, but history reminds us that the true impact of such moments is measured not in weeks or months, but in years. Structures endure longer than headlines. Assumptions last longer than explanations. For Nigeria, the task ahead is delicate. Strengthening security while preserving strategic autonomy requires discipline, transparency, and foresight. The choices made today will influence how the country negotiates tomorrow, not only in security, but in economics, diplomacy, and development. For the Sahel, this moment reinforces an ongoing lesson. Stability cannot be imported whole. It must be built, coordinated, and sustained from within the region, with partners who respect African leadership rather than replace it. And for my brothers and sisters in Black America, Jamaica, the Caribbean, and Europe, your role matters more than many realize. Awareness shapes narratives. Narratives shape policy. When Africa is understood only through crisis, its agency is diminished. When it is seen through strategy, dignity follows. This message is not a call to fear, and it is not a call to oppose. It is a call to pay attention, to ask the full questions, to recognize patterns early rather than explain consequences later. Geopolitics today moves quietly, through agreements that seem reasonable one by one, but transformative when combined. Africa must move with equal quiet strength, deliberate, coordinated, and awake. Because sovereignty, once negotiated away in small steps, is difficult to reclaim in large ones. That is why this moment matters.
Subscribe to Voice of Sovereign Africa today. Let's build a greater Africa together.